Let's look at one tool that's very heavily used when you're designing with or when you're working with graphics. This one is called Shape Tool. Now we've already seen everything that's about this tool in an earlier video, but let's go through all of this in detail. Now when I click on the Shape Tool, there are a couple of options which are available. There is rectangle, ellipse, triangle, polygon, line, and custom shape. Now each of these are predetermined shapes, but we can create more complex shapes with each of these as well. Let's understand the first settings over here. The couple of important settings that we'll just go through right now. In the options bar, you can see that there are a few things over here. The first one is to select the preset. There are a couple of presets which are available directly from Photoshop, and you can create your own presets later as well. We'll see how to do that. The next option is to create either a shape, path, or pixels. Now, when you create a shape, that basically means that this will be an editable shape. This shape, we can change the fill, stroke, and a couple of other settings as and when needed. If I do select a path, there are a couple of other options when we are working with this path, which you can use to create a selection, a mask, or a shape altogether. The third option is to create pixels. Now with pixels, it ends up creating a pixel base or a pixel map on the layer that has been selected. This makes the shape not selectable or not editable after the first creation has been done. It will be similar to using a paintbrush tool and actually painting directly pixels on a layer. Let's understand how the shape option works. The first set of settings that we do see over here are fill and stroke. We can select the color that we would want to choose. Let's say we have chosen this brown color, and for stroke we have a black color. The next option is the width of the stroke itself. I can increase the width or make it entirely 0. That's an option. Let's stick to about 5 points for this. And then the next option is to select a stroke type. So it could be either a solid, dashed, or dotted. There are a couple of other options, which is align, caps, and corners. To see all of these in detail, let me click on more options and see what are the different variations. So for the stroke, the solid preset, there are options which is align. Now align basically keeps the stroke of the shape in the inside the shape, on the center of the shape, or on the outside of the shape. Very similarly, the caps or the ends of the shape can have either a butt corner, a butt cap, a round cap, or a square cap. And the corners of the shape can have either a mitre, a round, or a bevel shape. There are also options to select or create a dashed lines. Let's see how all these work by creating the shape first. So if I do create a shape just like this, let me drag and create one over here. With this, you can see that there is an option. I do see the color over here. The stroke width is currently very low. Let's make it about 5 points. Click on enter, and then you see a stroke. Now over here, if you can notice, the stroke seems to be equally on the inside and the outside. That means the shape or the stroke is basically in the center. Now we can choose this and select a different option. The first one was inside. If I click on that, you will see that the stroke is an inside of the layer itself. And similarly, if I click on outside, the shape has a stroke which is outside the entire shape. We'll not be able to see caps in this case because this is a completely closed shape. That's why there is no cap that is visible. But you can definitely see the corners. You can see the current corners are squared corners. We can have, which is called mitre over here. We can have rounded corners, which is slightly rounded on the stroke. And then there is the option of bevel, which looks like that. Now notice that we're talking only about the stroke right now. We will see about the shape as well in the next set of settings. The next settings are to select the width and the height of the shape. Currently, the height and the width are defined by this. I can also change the width and the height as I would want. Let's make it slightly smaller, and I can reduce the height over here as well. Now this is possible just because we are working with shapes. I can click on the link button over here to make sure that the height and the width are now proportionate. And if I increase the height, the width will also increase proportionately. The next set of options are to select a new layer or to combine shapes. So with this shape I already have, I can create another shape that will get combined with this and end up creating a more complicated shape. So with this, you can see how the two layers have just combined, and the next option is to subtract front shape. Now what that basically means is it will reduce the shape from the front from the shape which is behind. The next option is to intersect shape areas. That will give you the intersection of these shapes and create a new shape out of it. Now in this case, this is a rectangle, but we could also create a couple of complicated shapes with different options. This is also something for exclude overlapping shapes. That basically means the entire area that has been overlapping has been excluded and everything else gets selected. Now there are a couple of other options to align these shapes and to move the shapes in front or back, but in this case we won't need it. Moving on to the next set of options, there are also paths to get created, and there are options for the roundness of the corners. The next option is to see rounded corners, but there's a better way to do it, and we can do it directly by clicking on these dots right over here, and if I pull these in, this will curve the shape by itself and create a rounded corner. Now I can do this by holding Alt and doing it only for one particular side. And I can just hold just one without pressing Alt, and all of the shapes get the similar rounded corners. So that's basically about the options for the rectangle shape. Very similarly, let's go through the other ones. If I delete this layer right now to declutter my screen, moving on to the ellipse tool, I can create something very similar over here. If I hold shift, I'll be able to constrain it in proportions and keep it as a circle instead of creating a ellipse. Now the options over here are very similar. Fill, stroke, the stroke type, width and height of the shape, a couple of other options that are repeating from the previous version. Very similarly, there is the triangle tool. Now with the triangle tool as well, I can create a new shape. If I hold shift, it will create a constraint or an equilateral triangle. Let's color the shape slightly different. And the settings that we do see over here are again similar. I can round the corners for this shape as well by doing something very similar to the previous one. If I pull this small circle in the center or towards the corner, I'll be able to change the roundedness of the edges. The next shape is the polygon tool. With polygon tool, there is a new setting that does come up, is basically the number of sides that are going to be in the polygon. With 5, if I create this, it's going to create a pentagon. Again, holding shift is going to allow me to create a constraint or a regular pentagon. And if I increase the size, let's say to 8, I'll be able to create a new shape with 8 sides. So those are settings for the pentagon. Everything else remains the same. Moving on, there is the line tool. Now with the line tool, I'll be able to create a single line from one place to another. I can hold shift to make it constrained to one particular angle. I can do it with 0 degrees, 45 degrees, 90 degrees, or basically in every other direction at 45 degree intervals. So with this, we'll be able to see something that we have not been able to till now, which is the caps. Let me remove everything else from here before moving forward. The next shape is the line tool. With the line tool, I can create lines from one direction to another. If I hold shift, I can constrain the line to a particular angle. Now these angles could be at difference of 45 degrees. So the first one is at 0. If I can tilt it slightly up, I'll get somewhat of a minus 45 degree, 90, 135. And similarly at 45 degree differences, I'll be able to create or constrain the angles. Now this is basically creating a line. I can increase the stroke so that this is slightly more visible. We had seen the presets earlier. Let's look at how the dashed or the dotted lines could look like. Now with the dashed lines, now we can see the different variations over here. Everything else remains very similar to the previous settings that we have seen. And lastly, there is a custom shape. Now with custom shape, the best feature is you can import a lot of different custom shapes that are defined by paths. We will see how to do that, and you can create your additional custom shapes according to those paths. So Photoshop over here has given me a couple of options which are slightly unusual shapes. And with these shapes, I can work very similarly to every other shape that has been there. Change the color, the stroke, or the kind of settings that are with that I can change the color or the stroke, and everything else remains very similar to the other shapes which are there. So that's basically everything about shapes. But here's one important tip that you can do. While you're creating any of these shapes, what you can do is instead of defining it from scratch, you can actually click on the center or a certain area in the canvas and determine a shape by defining its parameters. So if I just click on the setting over here, it can create a rectangle. I can set the settings right over here, the width and the height, let's say 200 by 500. It's going to create a vertical rectangle. I can set the radius of the corners. I can set the radius of from a single corner if I turn off the constraint proportions over here or the link button. I can do it for, let's say, 2 sides. And from center will basically create the shape from the center of the canvas. And from center will basically create the shape from the center where I clicked. So with this, I have gotten a new shape which is defined by the rectangle itself. And instead of clicking and dragging, if there are predetermined shapes and sizes that you want to do, you can do that with this. And that works for all of these settings over here. You can do this for ellipse, triangle, polygon. Of course, this is not possible with line. Now that you've seen how to use the custom shape tool with the shape option, let's see how does the path and the pixels work. With the path, I can create something very similar like what we have seen in the shape option. But with this, I have an option of creating either a selection, a mask, or a shape altogether. Now that basically means it gives me slightly higher options to do all of this. If I do create on a selection, it will create a selection or dotted lines over here that I can use for other purposes. Very similarly, I can create a mask out of it, and it will create a new vector mask that we've already seen. Now with this background layer, it will end up creating a vector mask so that I can see only this area and everything else is transparent. And the third option is to create a shape. And if I do that, it ends up creating a new shape that I can then use to adjust properties from the properties panel. Now, similar to the path option, the third option is pixels. Now, what that means is if I create a new shape over here, a new layer, it will create a set of pixels on the screen in the area that has been defined. Now, this loses out on any of the properties that we've been seeing with the shape layer, that is for the fill color or the stroke or the width or the stroke or the different types of stroke that we have seen, and that ends up creating a new layer altogether, which looks something like this. Now, this is an option that I'd use very rarely. So you might want to be really careful when you're doing this, and you can just go with the shape option. And the similar set of settings are available for everything else that we have seen. For ellipse, there's path and pixels and everything else, and every other shape layer tool that is there. And every other shape layer tool that is there, you have very similar options for path and pixels. And before we close on the shapes, here's one last tip that you can use. Instead of clicking and dragging different shapes over here by clicking or using your mouse, you can also do the same thing by clicking in front or clicking on your canvas, and a new dialog box pops up which looks something like this. Now with ellipse I have selected, I can set the width and the height from the center over here. Now what that basically means is I can set 500 by 500 from the center, and it will create a new ellipse of that proportion. I can do the same thing with a rectangle as well, and there are a couple of other options. If I click on over here, you create a new rectangle. I can set the width and the height, and there are options to set the radius of different corners. I can also link these corners and make it all equivalent, or I can unlink them and make the others 0, and let's say the top left and the bottom right corners can have the rectangle with a can have the rounded corners. So if I click on this, let's see these two sides have curved corners and the other ones have square corners. You can do that with all of the other shapes as well. Rectangle, ellipse, triangle, polygon, and custom shape. You can't do that with line because you'll not be able to define a certain point. And cut.